10.1 Determining your main ideas. When creating a speech, it's important to remember that speeches have three clear parts: an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. The introduction establishes the topic and whets your audience's appetite, and the conclusion wraps everything up at the end of your speech. The real meat of your speech happens in the body. In this section, we're going to discuss how to think strategically about the body of your speech. We like the word strategic because it refers to determining what is important or essential to the overall plan or purpose of your speech. Too often, new speakers just throw information together and stand up and start speaking. When that happens, audience members are left confused, and the reason for the speech might get lost. To avoid being seen as disorganized, we want you to start thinking critically about the organization of your speech. In this section, we will discuss how to take your speech from a specific purpose to creating the main points of your speech. What is your specific purpose? Before we discuss how to determine the main points of your speech, we want to revisit your speech's specific purpose, which we discussed in detail in Chapter 6. Recall that a speech can have one of three general purposes: to inform, to persuade, or to entertain. The general purpose refers to the broad goal for creating and delivering the speech. The specific purpose, on the other hand, starts with one of these broad goals, to inform, persuade, or entertain, and then further informs the listener about the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the speech. The specific purpose is stated as a sentence incorporating the general purpose, the specific audience for the speech, and a prepositional phrase that summarizes the topic. Suppose you're going to give a speech about using open source software. Here are three examples, each with a different general purpose and a different audience. General purpose: to inform. Specific purpose: to inform a group of school administrators about the various open source software packages that could be utilized in their school districts. General purpose: to persuade. Specific purpose: to persuade a group of college students to make the switch from Microsoft Office to the open source Office suite OpenOffice. General purpose: to entertain. Specific purpose: to entertain members of the business organization with a mock eulogy of for-pay software giants as a result of the proliferation of open source alternatives. In each of these three examples, you'll notice that the general topic is the same: open source software. But the specific purpose is different because the speech has a different general purpose and a different audience. Before you can think strategically about organizing the body of your speech, you need to know what your specific purpose is. If you have not yet written a specific purpose for your current speech, you need to go ahead and write it now. From specific purpose to main points. Once you have written down your specific purpose, you can now start thinking about the best way to turn that specific purpose into a series of main points. Main points are the key ideas you present to enable your speech to accomplish its specific purpose. In this section, we're going to discuss how to determine your main points and how to organize those main points into a coherent, strategic speech. How many main points do I need? While there's no magic number for how many main points a speech should have, speech experts generally agree that the fewer the number of main points, the better. First and foremost, experts on the subject of memory have consistently showed that people don't tend to remember very much after they listen to a message or leave a conversation. While many different factors can affect a listener's ability to retain information after a speech, how the speech is organized is an important part of that process. An experimental investigation, I'm just trying to get to the end of this citation. That is a long one. Okay, for the speeches you will be delivering in a typical public speaking class, you will usually have just 2 or 3 main points. If your speech is less than 3 minutes long, then 2 main points will probably work best. If your speech is between 3 and 10 minutes long, then it makes more sense to use 3 main points. You may be wondering why we are recommending only 2 or 3 main points. The reason comes straight out of the research on listening. According to Lefrancois, people are more likely to remember information that is meaningful, useful, and interesting to them. Different or unique, well-organized, visual, and simple. 2 or 3 main points are much easier for listeners to remember than 10 or even 5. In addition, if you have 2 or 3 main points, you'll be able to develop each one with examples, statistics, or other forms of support. Including support for each point will make your speech more interesting and more memorable for your audience. Narrowing down your main points. When you write your specific purpose and review the research you have done on your topic, you will probably find yourself thinking of quite a few points that you would like to make in your speech. Whether that's the case or not, we recommend taking a few minutes to brainstorm and develop a list of points. In brainstorming, your goal is to simply think of as many different points as you can, not to judge how valuable or important they are. What information does your audience need to know or understand your topic? Need to know to understand your topic. What information does your speech need to convey to accomplish its specific purpose? Consider the following example. Specific purpose: to inform a group of school administrators about the various open source software packages that could be utilized in their school district. Brainstorming list of points. Define open source software. Define educational software. List and describe the software commonly used by school districts. Explain the advantages of using open source software. Explain the disadvantages of using open source software. Review the history of open source software. Describe the value of open source software. Describe some educational open source software packages. Review the software needs of my specific audience. Describe some problems that have occurred with open source software. Now that you have brainstormed and developed a list of possible points, how do you go about narrowing them down to just 2 or 3 main ones? Remember, your main points are the key ideas that help build your speech. When you look over the preceding list, you can start to see that many of the points are related to one another. Your goal in narrowing down your main point is to identify which individual, potentially minor points can be combined to make major points. This process is called chunking because it involves taking smaller chunks of information and putting them together with like chunks to create a more fully developed chunk of information. Before reading our chunking of the preceding list, you can try and determine if you can determine the 3 large chunks out of the list. So they're saying to go back to look at the previous list. Specific purpose: to inform a group of school administrators about the various open source software packages that could be utilized in their school districts. Main point 1, school districts use software in their operations. Define educational software. List and describe software commonly used by schools. Main point 2, what is open source software? Define open source software. Review the history of open source software. Explain the advantages of using open source software. Describe the value of using open source software. Explain the disadvantages of using open source software. Describe some problems that have occurred with open source software. Main point 3, name some specific open source software packages that may be appropriate for these school administrators to consider. Review the software needs of my specific audience. Describe some educational open source software packages. You may notice that in the preceding list, the number of subpoints under each of the 3 main points is a little disjointed, and the topics don't go together clearly. That's all right. Remember that these are just general ideas at this point. It's also important to remember that there is often more than one way to organize a speech. Some of these points could be left out, and others developed more fully, depending on the purpose and the audience. We'll develop the preceding main points more fully in a moment. Helpful hints for preparing your main points. Now that we've discussed how to take a specific purpose and turn it into a series of main points, here are some helpful hints for creating your main points. Uniting your main points. Once you have generated a possible list of main points, you want to ask yourself this question. When you look at your main points, do they fit together? For example, if you look at the 3 preceding main points, school districts use software in their operations, what is open source software, name some specific open source software packages that may be appropriate for these school administrators to consider, ask yourself, do these main points help my audience understand my specific purpose? Suppose you added a 4th main point about open source software for musicians. Would this 4th main point go with the other 3? Probably not. While you may have a strong passion for open source music software, that main point is extraneous information for the speech you are giving. It doesn't help accomplish your specific purpose, so you would need to toss it out. Keeping your main points separate. The next question to ask yourself about your main points is whether they overlap too much. While some overlap may happen naturally because of the singular nature of a specific topic, the information covered within each main point should be clearly distinct from the other main points. Imagine you're giving a speech with the specific purpose to inform my audience about the health reasons for eating apples and oranges. You could then have 3 main points: that eating fruit is healthy, that eating apples is healthy, and that eating oranges is healthy. While the 2 points related to apples and oranges are clearly distinct, both of these main points would probably overlap too much with the first point, that eating fruit is healthy. So you would probably decide to eliminate the first point and focus on the second and third. On the other hand, you could keep the first point and then develop 2 new points, giving additional support to why people should eat fruit. Balancing main points. One of the biggest mistakes some speakers make is to spend most of their time talking about one of their main points and completely neglecting the other main points. To avoid this mistake, organize your speech so as to spend roughly the same amount of time on each main point. If you find that one of your main points is simply too large, you may need to divide that point into 2 main points. You may need to divide that point into 2 main points and consolidate your other main points into a single main point. Let's see if our preceding example is balanced. School districts use software in their operations. What is open source software? And name some specific open source software packages that may be appropriate for these school administrators to consider. What do you think? Obviously, the answer depends on how much time the speaker will have to talk about each of these main points. If you have an hour to talk, then you may find that these 3 main points are balanced. However, you may also find them wildly unbalanced if you only have 5 minutes to speak, because 5 minutes is not enough time to even explain what open source software is. If that's the case, then you probably need to rethink your specific purpose to ensure that you can cover the material in the allotted time. Creating parallel structure for main points. Another major question to ask yourself about your main points is whether or not they have parallel structure. By parallel structure, we mean that you should structure your main points so that they all sound similar. When your main points sound similar, it's simply easier for your audience to remember your main points and retain them for later. Let's look at our sample. School districts use software in their operations. What is open source software? And name some specific open source software. Notice that the first and third main points are statements, but the second one is a question. Basically, we have an example here of main points that are not parallel in structure. You could fix this in one of 2 ways. You could make them all questions. What are some common school district software programs? What is open source software? And what are some specific open source software packages that may be appropriate for these school administrators to consider? Or you could turn them all into statements. School districts use software in their operations. Define and describe open source software. Name some specific open source software packages that may be appropriate for these school administrators to consider. Either of these changes will make the grammatical structure of the main points parallel. Maintaining logical flow of main points. The last question you want to ask yourself about your main points is whether the main points make sense in the order that you've placed them. The next section goes into more detail of common organizational patterns for speeches, but for now, we want you to just think logically about the flow of your main points. When you look at your main points, can you see them as progressive, or does it make sense to talk about one first, another one second, and the final one last? If you look at your order and it doesn't make sense to you, you probably need to think about the flow of your main points. Often this process is an art and not a science, but let's look at a couple of examples. School dress codes example. Main point 1, history of school dress codes. Main point 2, problems with school dress codes. Main point 3, eliminating school dress codes. Rider law legislation. Main point 1, why should states have rider laws? Main point 2, what are the effects of a lack of rider laws? Main point 3. What is rider-law legislation? When you look at these two examples, what are your immediate impressions of the two examples? In the first example, does it make sense to talk about history and then the problems, and finally how to eliminate the school dress codes? Would it make sense to put history as your last main point? Probably not. In this case, the main points are in a logical sequence order. What about the second example? Does it make sense to talk about your solution and then your problem and then define the solution? Not really. What order do you think these main points should be placed in for a logical flow? Maybe you should explain the problem, the lack of rider laws, then define your solution, what is rider law legislation, and then argue for your solution, why states should have rider laws. Notice that in this example, you don't even need to know what rider laws are to see that the flow didn't make sense. Key takeaways. All speeches start with a general purpose and then move to a specific purpose that gives the who, what, when, where, and how for the speech. Transitioning from the specific purpose to possible main points means developing a list of potential main points you could discuss. Then you can narrow your focus by looking for similarities among your potential main points and combining ones that are similar. Shorter speeches will have 2 main points, while longer speeches will generally have 3 or more main points. When creating your main points, make sure that they are united, separate, balanced, parallel, and logical.